What would you do if the work that made you successful was never truly yours? Across a snow-covered road, a former Navy SEAL found the forgotten craftsman behind his best-selling design. The truth could return one man's name, but it could also destroy Mac Holloway's business, reputation, and home. His German shepherd, Bramble, had led him to the door, but no dog could make the choice that followed. Mac would have to decide whether protecting everything he built mattered more than admitting how it was built. This is a story about two stubborn craftsmen, one disputed desk, and the difficult repair no tool could complete. After the story, share what you would have done, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. By the last week of January, Alder Wake had taken on the hard, polished beauty of a place that understood winter and had stopped asking it to be kind. Snow rested thick on the steep roofs along Juniper Lane. The bare maples stood dark against a pale blue sky, and the distant white mountains caught the morning sun so sharply that Mac Holloway sometimes had to narrow his eyes when he stepped outside. On clear days, the whole town seemed built from glass, iron, and breath. Mac lived at the far end of the road in a cedar-sided house connected to a long, heated workshop. Across from him stood an old yellow Victorian that had been vacant for nearly 2 years. The bank had posted warnings on the front door. Plywood covered 2 ground-floor windows. The porch sagged slightly toward the road, and one of the decorative brackets beneath the roofline had split during the previous winter. Snow had nearly swallowed the foreclosure sign. Mac had watched the house deteriorate without taking much interest in it. A building could fail quietly if no one needed it. He understood that better than most. At 57, Cormac Holloway still carried himself like a man accustomed to entering unfamiliar rooms with his senses already working. He was broad through the shoulders, with short brown hair silvering heavily at the temples, and a face that had grown more angular with age. His right hip stiffened in cold weather, a souvenir from a life he rarely discussed with customers and never described in detail. Online, however, people knew that he had once been a Navy SEAL. They knew because Holloway Northworks had been built partly around that fact. His website showed photographs of Mac standing in his workshop in a canvas apron, sunlight falling across curls of maple and walnut. Product descriptions mentioned discipline, endurance, and quiet craftsmanship. A short biography described how he had turned to woodworking after leaving military service, finding peace in the patience of measuring, cutting, and joining wood. None of it was false. That was what made the rest of it difficult. Mac had begun woodworking because it slowed his mind. In the early years, when sleep came badly and silence felt too loud, he could spend 6 hours fitting a joint until the 2 pieces met without force. The work required attention, but not explanation. Wood did not ask him where he had been or why he sometimes stopped breathing when a truck backfired on the road. It only asked whether the cut was true. For a long time, that had been enough. Then the orders came. At first there were 3 a month, then 10, then 20. A home design account shared one of his writing desks, and a video of Mac planing a walnut edge spread far beyond the customers who had followed him before. People wanted the story as much as the furniture. The retired SEAL in the New Hampshire snow, making heirloom pieces alone by hand. The desk in the video was called the Monadnock desk. It had gently curved legs, a narrow hidden drawer beneath the writing surface, and a birdwing joint tucked underneath where most owners would never see it. Mac had acquired the digital design through a commercial pattern library recommended by a fabrication shop. He had altered the dimensions, adjusted the drawer, changed the wood selection, and refined the finish. Over time, the distinction between adapting a design and creating one had become less clear in his mind. The Monadnock desk became his signature piece. Its curved joint appeared in the Holloway Northworks logo. Customers wrote that they could recognize Mac's work from across a room. One interviewer described the desk as a physical expression of his disciplined solitude. Mac had read that sentence 3 times. Then he had allowed it to remain on the website. Now more than 70 Monadnock orders waited in his system. That morning, 8 unfinished sets of legs stood stacked beside the CNC machine. Shipping labels lay printed in neat rows on the office counter. A spreadsheet glowed on the wall-mounted monitor, each line representing a promise with a deadline attached. 6 weeks earlier, Mac had signed a loan for $120,000. The money had paid for the machine, additional storage, upgraded electrical work, and enough material to meet the growth he had told the bank was certain to continue. His house and workshop stood behind the loan. He understood risk. He had once believed that made him good at recognizing it. But there were risks that arrived loudly, and risks that slowly became part of the furniture. Bramble hated the CNC machine. The 7-year-old German Shepherd had a black and tan coat dark enough that he nearly disappeared in the shadows beneath the workbenches. A thin wash of silver had begun to show around his muzzle. His right ear leaned slightly outward from an old injury, giving him a permanently skeptical expression. Bramble had worked in search support during Mac's final years of service. He was retired now, though retirement had never changed the seriousness with which he watched doors, windows, and people. When Mac used a hand plane, Bramble often slept beside the bench. When the CNC machine started, he left. At first, Mac had blamed the pitch of the motor. He bought padded ear protection designed for working dogs, then moved Bramble's bed farther from the machine. Neither helped. The dog would rise as soon as the spindle began, walk to the side door, and lie outside on the covered porch, even when the temperature dropped below freezing. "You've gotten particular in your old age," Mac told him that morning. Bramble looked back through the glass, but did not come inside. Mac turned toward the machine again. The first set of legs emerged perfectly matched. That should have pleased him. Instead, he found himself remembering the years when no two pieces had ever been exactly alike. That evening, fresh snow began around dusk. It fell lightly at first, softening the road and filling the shallow tracks left by the delivery truck. Mac ate standing at the kitchen counter, answering customer messages with one hand, while Bramble watched the window. At 8:17, the dog barked. 3 low sounds. Not frantic, not playful, measured. Mac looked up. Bramble stood rigid near the front window, ears angled toward the abandoned house across the road. "What is it?" The dog did not look at him. He listened. Mac stepped closer and followed Bramble's line of sight. The Victorian stood dark beneath the snow. Nothing moved around the porch. No headlights had passed. No animal crossed the yard. A deer sometimes sheltered near the rear hedge. Raccoons got beneath the porch in warmer months. Wind could make the loose boards complain like footsteps. Mac waited another minute, then touched Bramble between the shoulders. Nothing there. The dog turned his head, not convinced. The next night, it happened again. New snow. 3 barks. The same fixed attention. Mac took binoculars from the hall cabinet. Through the glass, the house remained empty. The upper windows reflected moonlight. Snow lay unbroken across the front steps. He lowered the binoculars. Behind him, the CNC machine began another programmed cut. Bramble flinched at the sound, walked away from the window, and went outside. Mac watched him settle beneath the porch light, facing the house across the road. For the first time, the two things felt connected. Not logically, not in any way Mac could explain, but the machine had begun to sound less like progress, and more like something filling a room where another sound used to be. On the third night, snow came harder. Mac had a live sales session scheduled for the following morning, and 8 sets of desk legs left to cut. The production calendar said he needed to work until midnight. The loan payment schedule said he could not afford delays. Bramble stood at the window again. 3 barks. Mac ignored him. A few minutes later, the dog disappeared into the mudroom and returned carrying an old leather glove. He placed it at Mac's feet. Mac stared down. The glove was worn smooth across the palm and split slightly near the thumb. It had been stored in a lower cabinet with equipment he no longer used. During training years ago, Bramble had learned to retrieve it when he had located human scent in a designated search direction. The behavior was not magical. Dogs repeated old associations. Bramble might have smelled the leather. He might have wanted attention. He might have been reacting to Mac's tension. Still, Mac did not move for several seconds. The dog sat before him, waiting. "You're retired," Mac said quietly. Bramble's gaze did not change. Mac picked up the glove and set it on the counter. Then he returned to the workshop. The machine cut 6 more sets of legs. At 11:42, Bramble barked again. This time, when Mac looked across the road, he saw something rise from the chimney of the empty house. A thin line of smoke. It vanished almost immediately into the snowfall. Mac switched off the machine. The workshop fell silent, so suddenly that he could hear the faint ticking of the metal ductwork cooling overhead. He went to the window. There it was again. Smoke, pale against the dark trees. The wind shifted. Even through the closed glass, Bramble lifted his nose. Mac opened the door. Cold air entered with the smell of snow, distant wood smoke, and something else beneath it. Linseed oil, fresh sawdust. Mac knew both odors intimately. Someone was working with wood inside the abandoned house. Then, from across Juniper Lane, came the unmistakable crash of something heavy striking the floor. Bramble lunged once toward the road and stopped at Mac's command. Mac took out his phone and called the town's non-emergency number. The dispatcher told him patrol units were handling multiple weather-related accidents and would come as soon as one was free. Mac looked at the dark house. He thought of the loan payment due in 6 weeks, the uncut desk legs, the live sales session in the morning, the 70 customers waiting for furniture that carried his name. Then he looked at Bramble. The dog was not barking now. He was simply waiting for Mac to decide whether the signal mattered. Mac pulled on his winter coat. He took a flashlight from the mudroom, added a small first aid kit to his pocket, and clipped the leash to Bramble's collar. He told himself he was only going to check whether someone needed help, nothing more. Outside, snow gathered on his shoulders before he reached the end of the porch. Across the road, the old Victorian stood dark, except for the faintest suggestion of smoke above the chimney. Mac stepped down into the new snow. Behind him, the workshop lights continued to burn over rows of unfinished desks. Ahead of him waited a house that was supposed to be empty. He did not yet understand that it held something more dangerous than a trespasser. It held a question about who had truly built the life he was trying so hard to protect. The snow had already begun erasing Mac's tracks by the time he and Bramble reached the road. Juniper Lane was empty. The storm had narrowed the world to the cone of Mac's flashlight, the white sweep of falling snow, and the dark shape of the Victorian beyond it. Behind them, his workshop windows glowed across the road with the clean, steady light of a place where everything had a designated shelf and a written deadline. The house ahead offered no such order. Bramble crossed at Mac's left knee, the leash loose between them. He did not pull toward the front porch. Instead, he lowered his head and moved along the snowbank, following a scent that led toward the side of the property. Mac noticed the route immediately. The front walk was untouched. Anyone using the main entrance would have left a visible trail through the new snow. Near the side hedge, however, a narrow depression ran between the house and an overgrown lilac bush. Fresh snow had softened its edges, but had not fully concealed it. Someone had been walking there. Mac stopped beneath the broken porch lamp and listened. No voices, no footsteps, only the wind moving through dry branches and the faint metallic knock of something loose against the house. He called out, "Hello. This is Cormac Holloway from across the road. I've contacted the police." The words vanished into the storm. Bramble's ears shifted toward the rear of the building. Mac tried the front door without putting pressure on it. Locked. The plywood over the windows was secured from outside. Through a narrow gap at one edge, he could see only a dark front room, with sheets draped over furniture shapes. Bramble continued toward the side yard. There, partly hidden behind the lilacs, Mac found a set of concrete steps descending to a basement entrance. Someone had cleared them recently, with a narrow shovel. Snow had already begun filling the path again, but one boot print remained visible near the bottom step, an adult-sized print. The cellar door sat slightly crooked in its frame. Mac called out again, louder this time. A cough answered from inside. It was low and rough, followed by the scrape of metal against concrete. Mac's hand tightened around the flashlight. "Can you hear me?" No response. He tried the handle. The door moved inward less than an inch and caught against something on the other side. Mac did not force it immediately. The police had been notified. Entering a foreclosed property could create problems, and he had spent enough of his life understanding the consequences of moving before all the information was available. Then Bramble pressed his nose to the gap and released one short breath through his nostrils. Not a bark. Recognition. Mac pushed again, harder. Something wooden dragged across the floor. The opening widened enough for him to see the edge of an overturned crate. He angled his shoulder through and shifted it with his boot. Warm, fouled air escaped from the basement. Smoke, not open flame, but the dense, bitter smell of incomplete combustion. Mac pulled his coat sleeve over his mouth. "Stay behind me." Bramble ignored the exact wording, but obeyed the intent. Holding close as Mac entered. The basement was larger than the house suggested. Stone foundation walls disappeared into shadow. Shelves leaned under stacks of offcuts, jars of hardware, planes, chisels, and clamps darkened by years of use. A cast-iron stove glowed weakly near the far wall. Its pipe had separated at one joint, allowing smoke to gather beneath the ceiling. A man sat on the floor beside a heavy workbench. A rack of lumber had collapsed behind him, scattering boards across the concrete. He was not trapped, but one long plank pinned the lower edge of his coat. He looked older than Mac had expected, and more alert than a man in his position had any right to be. His white hair reached the collar of a wool shirt. His face was narrow, with deep lines around the mouth and eyes that remained sharp despite the smoke. He had the lean frame of someone who had spent a lifetime standing at benches rather than desks. His hands were swollen at the knuckles, but one still gripped a short iron pry bar. "Get out," the man said. His voice was cracked, but the hostility in it was intact. Mac moved toward the stove instead. "The pipe's loose." "I know what's loose." Mac set the flashlight on the bench and used a leather glove to close the stove vent. He opened the cellar door fully, then crossed to a small window near the ceiling and forced it upward. Cold air rushed in. The old man coughed harder. Bramble moved past Mac and positioned himself between the man and the stove. His body remained still, attention fixed on both hazards at once. Mac pointed at the plank, pinning the coat. "Are you injured?" "No." That answer usually means yes. It means the coat is caught. Mac lifted the plank. The man pulled free and tried to stand without assistance. His knees failed halfway up. Mac caught his arm. The man jerked away as soon as he had his balance. "I said I don't need help. You're sitting in a smoke-filled basement with lumber on top of you." It was beside me. That distinction may matter to you more than it does to an ambulance crew. At the word ambulance, the man's expression changed. Not fear of injury, fear of consequence. "No ambulance." Mac studied him more carefully. There was soot along one sleeve, sawdust caught in his hair, and a tremor in his left hand that might have come from cold, exhaustion, or poor air. His clothes were layered, but worn. A canvas tool apron hung from a nail nearby. A camp cot stood in the far corner beneath two blankets. This was not someone who had entered for an hour to steal copper pipe. He had been living here. Mac heard tires outside. Then the muted pulse of red light through the basement window. The man saw it too. "You called them." "I told you I did." "You had no right." Mac glanced at the cot, the food tins, the bucket of split wood. "Neither do you, apparently." For the first time, the man looked away. The sentence had landed somewhere deeper than Mac intended. Two police officers came down the steps, followed by a paramedic carrying a medical bag. The older officer recognized Mac and gave him a brief nod before taking in the room. The man by the bench straightened. "My name is Silas Bellweather," he said before anyone could ask. I am not confused. I am not lost. And I am not stealing from this house. The older officer's expression softened slightly. That last part may be complicated, Mr. Bellweather. Silas's mouth tightened. The paramedic, a compact woman with gray-streaked hair tucked under a knit cap, checked his oxygen level despite his objections. The reading was low enough to justify concern, but improved after several minutes near the open door. Silas refused transport. He answered questions clearly, knew the date, identified the property address, and insisted the stovepipe had separated only moments before the shelf fell. The officer asked how he had entered the house. Silas answered, "With a key. Do you own the property?" Silas looked around the basement before replying. "I did." The words changed the atmosphere. Mac followed Silas's gaze and saw the room differently. The tools were not randomly gathered. Their positions suggested habits built over years. Chisels were arranged by width. Handplanes rested on their sides. Pencil lines marked the workbench where certain clamps belonged. Even the cot had been placed to avoid blocking the path between the bench and the stove. This had once been a workshop. Perhaps it still was, in the only way Silas was willing to acknowledge. The officer explained that the bank now held the property and that Silas could not remain inside. Arrangements would have to be made for him to retrieve personal belongings later, with authorization. Silas gave a humorless smile. Personal belongings? Is that what we call 40 years of a man's hands now? No one answered. While the officers continued speaking with him, Mac turned toward the workbench. A sheet of craft paper lay beneath a brass lamp. Pencil drawings covered it. Front elevation, drawer construction, leg geometry, and a curved joint beneath the writing surface. Mac felt his attention narrow. He moved closer. The shape was unmistakable. The winged joint from the Monadnock desk. Not similar in a general way. Not part of a broad furniture tradition. The proportions matched. The hidden drawer rail was offset by the same fraction. Even the slight imbalance in the curve. The detail Mac's pattern file had preserved, without explaining, was there. Beside the drawing stood an unfinished writing desk. Its top had not yet been attached. One leg was clamped in place. The wood was older maple, with dark mineral streaks. But the structure beneath it mirrored the product stacked in Mac's workshop across the road. Silas noticed where he was looking. "Don't touch that." Mac withdrew his hand. "Where did you get this design?" Silas stared at him, as though the question itself were offensive. "Where did I get it?" Mac pointed toward the joint. "I sell a desk built on this pattern." Silas's eyes moved to the Holloway Northworks logo stitched on Mac's coat. Recognition came slowly, then all at once. He laughed. The sound had no amusement in it. It was closer to disbelief. Finally, finding a voice. "So that's you." Mac felt the room become smaller. "What does that mean?" Silas looked at the logo again. "It means I've been watching pieces of my life arrive in delivery trucks with another man's name on the boxes." The officers fell silent. Mac did not react outwardly. Years of training made stillness easy when other people expected surprise. Inside, however, something shifted out of alignment. He reached for the nearest drawing. Silas struck the paper flat with one swollen hand. "I told you not to touch it." Mac met his eyes. "If you're saying I stole this, I need more than a drawing sitting in a basement." Silas pulled open a shallow bench drawer and removed a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were sketches on yellowed paper, invoices from regional craft fairs, and photographs of furniture displayed beneath a sign reading, "Bellweather and Voss." Several pages carried dates from 14 years earlier. Mac examined them without taking them from Silas's hand. Dates could be added later. Photographs could be copied. A skilled craftsman could reconstruct a design already circulating online. Grief and pride could reshape memory until a person believed what he needed to believe. Mac had learned not to confuse certainty with truth. Silas seemed to read the doubt in his face. "You think I copied you? I think I don't know you." That has never stopped men from selling what I made. The paramedic interrupted before the exchange could harden further. Silas needed warmth, clean air, and observation for several hours. The town shelter was operating at capacity because of the storm. A motel near the highway had lost power. The officer asked whether Silas had family nearby. No. The answer came too quickly. Mac looked toward the cot. Silas could not stay in the house. Leaving him at the station for the night was possible. But the officers were already dealing with weather calls. The paramedic could not force transport while he remained alert and refused. Mac heard himself speak before he had fully accepted the decision. He can stay across the road. Silas turned toward him. No. One night. No. You need somewhere warm. I need people to stop deciding what I need. The anger in Silas's voice was not theatrical. It was the practiced defense of a man who had lost property, work, and authority, one document at a time. Mac understood the instinct well enough to resent it. Then decide, he said. My guest room, the police station, or the hospital. Silas's jaw worked. Bramble walked to him and sat. The dog did not lean against him or offer a paw. He simply settled beside Silas's boots, as if the decision had already been made. Silas looked down. For a few seconds, the hardness left his face. He reached toward Bramble, stopped before touching him, then lowered his hand. You trained him? We trained each other. Bramble remained where he was. Silas closed his eyes briefly. One night, he said. The officers escorted them out after securing the basement. Silas insisted on carrying the cloth bundle of drawings himself. Mac carried the small bag the paramedic had packed from the cot. Outside, the snow had thickened. They crossed Juniper Lane in the patrol car because Silas's breathing had not fully recovered. Mac sat in front. Silas and Bramble occupied the rear seat. No one spoke. Through the windshield, Mac could see his workshop growing larger. The rows of unfinished Monadnock desks visible beneath the lights. In the rearview mirror, Silas held the bundle of drawings against his chest. Bramble rested his head on the old man's knee. Silas did not push him away. Mac looked from the dog to the papers, and then toward the workshop, where 70 orders waited under his name. He had crossed the road expecting to find a trespasser. Instead, he was bringing home a man who claimed that the most recognizable thing Mac had ever built had belonged to him first. And Bramble, who distrusted almost everything Mac could not explain, had already decided that Silas was worth staying beside. Silas slept for less than 2 hours. Mac knew, because the guest room floorboards creaked at 3. 11 inches the morning, followed by the quiet turn of the bathroom tap and the dry, restrained cough of someone trying not to be heard. By dawn, the storm had weakened to a fine powder drifting from the eaves. The patrol car's tracks across Juniper Lane had already blurred. From the kitchen window, the old Victorian looked sealed again, as though the night's intrusion had never happened. Silas sat at Mac's table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. He had refused a clean shirt, accepted a wool blanket only after Bramble lay on one corner of it, and ignored the toast Mac placed nearby. In daylight he looked less dangerous and more exhausted, though the distinction did not make him easier company. The bundle of drawings rested on the chair beside him. Mac stood at the counter, reading an email from a customer asking whether her desk would still ship by Friday. He typed a response, deleted it, then locked the phone. You need to eat. Silas looked at the toast. I need my tools. The police said the bank has to authorize access. The bank has never sharpened a blade in its life. That doesn't change the lock. Silas took one sip of coffee. Mac disliked the way the man spoke, as if every practical fact were evidence of someone else's moral failure. Yet the irritation was useful. It kept the larger question at a distance. The drawings could be real. The invoices could be authentic. That did not mean the rights had not been transferred. It did not mean Silas had designed every detail. It did not mean Mac had knowingly taken anything. Legal ownership and historical authorship were not always the same thing. Mac repeated that thought until it sounded less like a conclusion and more like a defense. At 7, He opened the workshop. Silas followed without being invited. The heat came on with a metallic hum. Rows of unfinished monadnock parts occupied the assembly tables. Cut legs stood in matching sets, each tagged with an order number. The CNC machine waited at the far end, beneath its extraction ducts. Silas stopped inside the doorway. His gaze moved across the workshop slowly. Mac expected anger. What he saw instead was recognition, stripped of affection, like a man entering a rebuilt version of a room where something bad had happened. "You make all of these here?" Silas asked. "Most of the work." "Most. The rough stock comes milled. Some components are cut by a partner shop when volume is high." Silas walked to the nearest stack of desk legs and ran one finger along the curve without lifting the wood. "No tear out. The machine doesn't get tired." "No," Silas said. "It only makes the same mistake 70 times. Mac felt his jaw tighten. He activated the dust system and loaded a maple blank into the CNC bed. "I have deadlines." "Everyone has deadlines. That's how bad decisions learn to dress like necessities." Mac turned toward him. "You stayed in a condemned basement with a broken stove." "It wasn't condemned when I built the bench." "That sentence doesn't make you sound wiser." For a moment, Silas almost smiled. Then the spindle started. Bramble rose from beside the wall and left through the side door. Silas watched him go. The dog has sense. The dog dislikes the frequency. "Does he leave when you use a hand plane?" Mac did not answer. The machine began cutting the first curve. Silas moved closer, not to admire it, but to study the tool path on the monitor. His shoulders were narrow beneath the borrowed blanket, and his hands trembled slightly at rest. When he raised one hand to point at the screen, the tremor disappeared. "That inside radius is wrong," he said. "It matches the file." "That is what I said." Mac stopped the machine. The sudden silence seemed to please neither of them. Silas pointed to the digital model. "The curve looks decorative." "It isn't. The weight from the hidden drawer pulls inward during dry months. That shoulder should sit 3/16 farther back. The desks have passed load tests. In a climate-controlled shop. They ship all over the country." "Exactly." Mac crossed his arms. "You expect me to accept that because you say it with confidence?" "No. I expect you to look at your repair records." The answer unsettled him because it was specific. Mac had 12 warranty cases open. Most concerned finish checking, drawer alignment, or seasonal movement. He had attributed them to low indoor humidity and inconsistent home maintenance. Silas had not seen the records. Before Mac could respond, headlights crossed the workshop windows. A dark green wagon stopped beside the loading door. Raina Caldwell entered carrying a leather portfolio and a paper bag from the bakery in North Conway. At 49, she had the composed energy of someone who considered lateness a character flaw. Her dark hair was pinned loosely at the back of her head, and the long camel coat she wore looked too refined for a floor marked with sawdust. She took in Silas, the blanket, and the stopped CNC machine. "So?" she said. "This is not a normal production delay." Mac had called her before dawn and given only the outline. Raina placed the bag on the office counter. "I brought food, and I brought every contract I could find related to the Monadnock files." Silas looked at her portfolio. "You brought paper to explain the paper." "I brought paper because courts do not accept wounded dignity as a filing system." Mac expected Silas to react. Instead, he studied her with interest. "You sell furniture. I sell work people are willing to pay for. That is not the same thing." "No," Raina said. "But without it, craftsmen become men sleeping in basements beside unsold principles." The words struck harder than she intended. Silas's face closed. Mac stepped between them verbally, before the conversation could become something else. "Show us the contracts." Raina spread the documents across the office table. The chain began with a design archive called Northridge Pattern Cooperative. The archive licensed a digital desk file to a regional fabrication company. That company later sold Mac a commercial production license as part of a broader agreement covering several patterns. The signatures appeared valid. The payments were recorded. Nothing in the documents named Silas Bellweather. Raina tapped the final page. This is the file you purchased. The license allows commercial reproduction, adaptation, marketing, and resale. Silas did not touch it. Who gave Northridge the right to sell it? That is the question, Raina said. But until we answer it, Mac is not automatically a thief. Silas looked at Mac. No. He is a man who benefited from not asking. The distinction landed too close to Mac's own thoughts. Raina continued. Northridge acquired a package of workshop assets from Bellweather and Voss through an intermediary. At the sound of the second name, Silas became still. Everett. Everett Voss? Raina asked. Silas nodded once. The room shifted again, not with revelation but with the arrival of an old grievance that had been waiting for a name. Silas explained that Bellweather and Voss had once operated out of the Victorian and an adjoining carriage house. Silas designed and built. Everett handled suppliers, invoices, exhibitions, and later the digital catalog. When Silas's wife, Margaret, became ill, the division widened. Hospital visits replaced trade shows. Bills accumulated. Everett offered to scan the drawings, organize the archive, and protect the business from collapse. Silas allowed it. He did not register every design. He did not insist on individual contracts. He believed reputation was a stronger defense than documentation. I thought anyone who knew the work would know whose hand made it, he said. Raina leaned back. That is not how ownership works. It was how honor worked. And how well did honor protect you? Silas's eyes hardened, but he did not answer. Mac understood then that Silas's story was not one of simple theft. Pride had created openings. Grief had made him inattentive. Everett might have exploited both. But Silas had helped build the conditions that made exploitation possible. That did not absolve anyone. It only made blame less convenient. Mac opened the warranty database. He searched for drawer fracture. 9 cases appeared. Silas moved beside him. Each photograph showed a narrow split near the hidden drawer rail. Different homes. Different wood species. The same location. Silas did not look triumphant. He looked tired. That is the shoulder, he said. The digital file flattened it. Raina studied the photos. You could have found this online. Silas turned toward her. Yes. He walked to the scrap rack, selected a short piece of maple, and placed it on the bench. Give me a pencil. Mac handed him one. Silas drew without measuring. A curved line. Then a second offset beneath it. He marked the hidden drawer load, the seasonal compression point, and the asymmetric joint that compensated for both. His swollen fingers moved slowly, but there was no hesitation in the sequence. Mac watched the design emerge not as an image, but as reasoning. Anyone could copy a shape. It was harder to copy the memory of why the shape had been made that way. Silas set down the pencil. Let me make it. Mac looked at him. From memory? Unless your machine is willing to explain it. Mac retrieved a handsaw, a chisel roll, and a small plane. Silas rejected 2 of the chisels before selecting the narrowest one. He checked the edge with his thumb, frowned, and sharpened it on Mac's stone, without asking permission. Then he began. The work was not graceful in the romantic way customers imagined craftsmanship. Silas had to pause twice to flex his fingers. His breathing remained shallow from the smoke. He adjusted his stance to relieve one knee. But the joint took shape with an authority the digital file did not possess. He cut the asymmetry first, then the supporting shoulder, then a shallow relief channel, invisible, once assembled. Mac had never noticed that channel in the old drawings. His file did not contain it. What does that do? Raina asked. Silas did not look up. Gives the wood somewhere to move without asking permission. The sentence stayed with Mac. By noon, the joint was complete. It was not polished. It was not fitted into a desk. Yet, when Mac placed it beside one of the machine-cut parts, the difference was clear. The digital version imitated the silhouette. Silas's version carried the internal logic. Bramble had returned and lay asleep beneath the bench. Mac looked at the dog, then at Silas's hands. He was no longer deciding whether the older man was merely convincing. He was deciding what kind of proof he was willing to recognize. Raina made 2 calls. The first was to an intellectual property attorney. The second was to Owen Kittredge, a retired building inspector, who worked part-time with the Alderwake Historical Society. Owen arrived after lunch, carrying a chair wrapped in an old moving blanket. He was a broad, square-built man of 61, with a weather-reddened face and silver hair cut close to the scalp. His reading glasses hung from a cord around his neck. He greeted Mac, nodded to Raina, and stopped when he saw Silas. "Well," Owen said, "you look worse than the last time you insulted my roof framing." Silas stared at him. "You still own it." Owen unwrapped the chair. Black cherry wood caught the winter light. The back rail curved in 2 uneven arcs, and beneath the seat sat the same offset joint. "I bought it from you at the Hanover Fair," Owen said, 22 years ago. "My wife said it was too expensive. She has been gone 8 years, and the chair still doesn't wobble." Silas placed one hand on the back rail. Something in his face changed. Not pride exactly, but the pain of being recognized by an object when people had failed to do so. Owen turned the chair over. Beneath the seat, almost hidden by age-darkened finish, were 3 shallow chisel marks arranged in a diagonal line. "The Bellweather marks," Owen said. He put them where no customer would notice. Mac examined the unfinished desk part Silas had made that morning. The same 3 marks sat near the relief channel. Owen looked at the contracts Raina had spread out. "This proves he built in this language long before Holloway Northworks existed," he said. "It does not prove who currently owns the commercial rights." Silas withdrew his hand from the chair. Mac appreciated Owen's refusal to turn evidence into certainty. "What does it prove?" Mac asked. "That history and law are asking different questions." The workshop became quiet. Across the room, 70 orders remained attached to a design Mac might still be legally entitled to sell. That evening, after Raina and Owen left, Silas returned to the guest room with the drawings. Bramble followed him to the hallway, then came back to the workshop. Mac sat alone at the office computer. He opened the Holloway Northworks website. The Monadnock page filled the screen. There was the desk, photographed beside a window during snowfall. Beneath it was the story Mac had approved years earlier. A design born from solitude, service, and the discipline of rebuilding a life by hand. The words were not technically part of the license. They were his. Mac read them twice. Then he opened the warranty photographs and placed them beside Silas's hand-drawn joint. He could still argue that he had purchased the file legally. He could still argue that his modifications created a distinct commercial product. He could still argue that Silas's failure to protect the designs was not Mac's responsibility. All 3 statements might be true, yet none answered the question forming beneath them. Mac had believed the danger was discovering that he had sold another man's design. The deeper danger was realizing he had used that design to tell a story about himself. He had not only attached his logo to Silas's work, he had attached his own loneliness, his service, and his recovery to it. Until customers could no longer separate the furniture from the man they believed had imagined it. In the dark reflection of the monitor, Mac could see the workshop behind him. Perfectly matched legs, numbered orders, a sleeping dog, and, on the far bench, one rough joint made by an old man who had remembered not merely its shape, but the reason the wood needed room to move. Mac closed the website without editing it, not because he had decided what to do, because for the first time, he understood that doing nothing would also be a decision. The attorney called at 9 the next morning. Mac took the call in the office, with the door partly closed. Through the glass, he could see Silas at the far bench, Sorting through a box of old brass hardware Owen had brought back from the Victorian. Bramble lay between the two rooms, his body positioned so he could watch both men without choosing one. Raina joined by speakerphone. The attorney's name was Judith Vale. She spoke with the deliberate restraint of someone accustomed to being quoted later. She had reviewed the license Mac purchased, the asset transfer documents connected to North Ridge Pattern Cooperative, the surviving Bellweather and Voss records, and photographs of Silas's older work. Her conclusion did not belong to either man. Silas had strong evidence that he developed the design language and probably the specific structure behind the Monadnock desk. Everett Voss, however, had possessed broad administrative authority within the old partnership. Several asset transfers appeared valid. Others were ambiguous. The surviving documents did not clearly establish whether Everett had sold complete ownership, limited reproduction rights, or assets he had no authority to transfer alone. Could Mac continue producing the desk? Raina asked. Judith paused. He could argue that he acquired the license in good faith. That is not what I asked. It is the most accurate answer. Mac watched Silas through the glass. The older man had found a bent drawer pull and was straightening it with small taps from a wooden mallet. What happens if Silas sues? Mac asked. Both sides spend money neither side appears to have. The case could take years. Mr. Bellweather's historical claim is credible. But credibility is not the same as a clean chain of title. Your license gives you a defensible position, but not a comfortable one. And if I keep selling while this is unresolved, you increase revenue and potential exposure at the same time. Raina leaned toward the phone. What would you advise a client to do? I would advise a client to separate 3 questions. What is legal? What is financially survivable? What can the client defend publicly without misleading anyone? Mac looked again at Silas. Judith continued. Those questions may not produce the same answer. After the call ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Silas placed the repaired drawer pull beside 3 others. So the law has found a way to keep everyone uncertain long enough to charge by the hour. Raina closed her portfolio. The law did not create your missing paperwork. No, I did that myself. The absence of argument made the admission heavier. Mac expected Silas to defend his younger self, to blame Margaret's illness, Everett's betrayal, or the chaos of unpaid bills. Instead, he stared at the row of brass pulls, as though each one represented a decision he had once believed too small to matter. Raina left for North Conway, after arranging for a financial review. By afternoon, Laurel Finch arrived. She did not look like someone who delivered catastrophes. She wore practical winter boots, a navy quilted coat, and frameless glasses that made her expression seem gentler than it was. Her silver blonde hair was cut short around a narrow face. She carried no leather portfolio, only a laptop and a yellow legal pad covered in compact handwriting. Laurel worked with small businesses that had grown too quickly or begun failing too slowly. She greeted Silas without asking for his story. Then she sat across from Mac and requested access to every account connected to Holloway Northworks. For 2 hours, she reviewed loan terms, order deposits, payroll, material invoices, shipping obligations, insurance, and the contracts with Raina's gallery and 2 online retailers. Mac remained standing for the first 20 minutes. Laurel finally looked up. You may sit down. The numbers will not improve because you are prepared to leave the room. Mac took the chair opposite her. Laurel turned the laptop so he could see. The business looked healthy from a distance. Revenue had risen for 3 consecutive years. The order book was full. Deposits were strong. The structure beneath that success was more fragile. Mac had used current deposits to purchase materials for future production. The expansion loan required a minimum monthly revenue level. The large CNC machine had its own financing agreement. 2 retail contracts included penalties for delayed delivery. Refunds on all unfulfilled Monadnock orders would consume nearly all available cash and still leave a deficit. If you suspend this product for 90 days, Laurel said, you will probably violate the revenue covenant. Probably, unless the bank grants temporary relief. And if they do not, They can raise the rate, demand additional collateral, or declare default. Mac's house was already collateral. Laurel did not need to say it. She moved to the next page. If you refund every customer immediately, you will need to sell equipment or borrow against the house again. No more borrowing. That simplifies the choices, not the consequences. Silas stood near the office door, listening without pretending otherwise. Mac looked at the figures. Numbers had always calmed him. They were supposed to reduce uncertainty by giving it boundaries. These numbers did the opposite. They translated moral discomfort into square footage, interest rates, missed payroll, and the possible loss of the room in which he had once learned to sleep again. Laurel folded her hands. I am not here to tell you whether to disclose the design dispute. Mac looked at her. Then what are you here to tell me? What honesty costs in dollars? The sentence was not cruel. That made it harder to reject. Laurel listed the options without dressing them in virtue. Continue production while the legal review proceeded. Suspend new orders, but complete those already paid for. Offer customers a choice. Negotiate a temporary agreement with Silas. Sell the CNC machine. Reduce staff hours. Ask the bank for forbearance before, not after. A missed payment. Each path preserved something and endangered something else. What would you do? Mac asked. Laurel shook her head. I do not have your name on the products. After she left, the workshop seemed too large. Silas remained in the office doorway. You should keep selling, he said. Mac looked up sharply. Silas entered and placed the cloth bundle of drawings on the desk. Pay me for what is already sold. Give me enough to rent a room and recover my tools. Keep the design. Keep my name out of it. Keep the design. Keep my name out of it. Max studied him. That is what you want? It is what ends this. For who? For both of us. Silas's voice was flat, almost businesslike. But his right thumb moved repeatedly over the frayed edge of the cloth. Mac understood the proposal. A private settlement. No lawsuit. No public dispute. Silas would receive money and shelter. Holloway Northworks would continue. Customers would never know the design history had been questioned. It was not entirely unjust. Silas had no appetite for court, no home, and no dependable income. Mac had a business, a debt, and customers who had paid in good faith. A settlement could recognize harm without destroying everything built afterward. Mac imagined the agreement already drafted. A lump sum, a release of claims, a confidentiality clause, a signature beneath language stating that no party admitted wrongdoing. For a few minutes, the offer felt like mercy. Then the CNC machine started in the main workshop. A scheduled program Mac had forgotten to cancel activated the spindle. The sharp mechanical whine passed through the office wall. Bramble rose at once. He walked toward the side door, stopped, and looked back. Silas watched him. Mac shut down the program from the office terminal. The spindle slowed. The extraction fan continued briefly, then faded. Bramble did not return immediately. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It exposed what the machine had covered. Silas picked up the bundle. The dog does not like your equipment. He doesn't like that machine. Same thing, if that is the machine making the work. Mac stood. The machine is not the problem. No. The problem is what I let people believe about it. Silas looked toward the assembly tables. That sounds like a distinction you have only recently learned to make. Mac felt the insult, but not enough to defend against it. He asked, What is the unfinished desk for? Silas's hand tightened around the drawings. That is not part of this. You went back into a foreclosed house in winter to finish it. It is part of something. Silas moved toward the guest room. Mac did not follow. Later, while carrying clean towels down the hall, he noticed a photograph partly exposed beneath the cloth bundle on the dresser. He should have kept walking. Instead, he stopped. The photograph showed a much younger Silas standing beside a woman with dark red hair. She shared his narrow face, but not his severity. One arm was hooked through his, while Silas held himself stiffly, as though even affection required proper posture. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, Silas and Nadine Portland, 1998. Beside the photograph lay several sealed envelopes. None had stamps. Each was addressed to Nadine Bellweather. Mac backed away before Silas returned. At dinner, he said nothing about what he had seen. Silas ate in silence. Bramble lay beneath the table, his head resting on his front paws. The old man gave the dog small pieces of chicken when he thought Mac was not looking. After the dishes were cleared, Silas finally spoke. My sister wanted to sell the workshop. Mac waited. Margaret was sick. The bills had gone beyond what the business could carry. Nadine said the building was an asset, and Margaret was a person. She was wrong? No. The answer came after a long pause. I told her selling the workshop would erase everything Margaret and I had built. I said Nadine had always been good at reducing lives to numbers. Silas stared at his hands. She sold some of the tools anyway. One she believed I would not notice. Paid part of the hospital debt. And you cut her off. I called it theft. The bitterness in his voice was directed inward now. Mac understood why the desk mattered. It is for her. Silas nodded. I started it before Margaret died. I thought I would finish it when I was ready to apologize. How long ago was that? 4 years. Mac looked toward the dark window. The Victorian stood across the road without light or smoke, stripped of the illusion that it was merely abandoned. Silas had returned, not only for the tools, he had returned because an unfinished apology was still clamped to a bench. Why not call her? Mac asked. Silas gave a small, exhausted laugh. Because a man can spend his life working with difficult material and still be a coward about a telephone. The admission changed the shape of the room. Mac had viewed Silas first as an intruder, then as an accuser, then as a possible victim. Now he saw a man who had made a religion of craftsmanship, because wood was easier to govern than grief. Silas had been exploited. He had also made himself nearly impossible to help. The two truths did not cancel each other. They belonged to the same man. The next morning, Silas returned to the bench and began shaping a replacement drawer guide for the unfinished desk. His fingers were stiff, forcing him to work in short intervals. Mac watched from across the shop. When the machine remained off, Bramble came inside and settled near Silas's boots. Silas fitted the guide without checking the old drawing. The movement was slow, practiced, almost private. Mac thought of the settlement again. He could pay Silas, secure the rights, protect the company, and keep every difficult fact contained in a document no customer would ever read. But Silas did not need Mac to turn him into the face of a public redemption campaign. He did not need his grief edited into a product story or his mistakes removed to make him easier to admire. He needed the right to decide which parts of his life belonged to the market. Mac walked to the bench. I am not buying your silence. Silas stopped working. His expression hardened immediately. You think I need charity? No. Then take the agreement. I said I'm not buying your silence. So you plan to use my name instead. I have not decided what I plan to do. Silas gave him a cold look. That is convenient. Mac did not move. But I know I will not solve the problem of your name being removed by paying you to keep it removed. The words hung between them. Silas looked down at the drawer guide. For once, he had no quick answer. Mac continued. You decide what is said about you. You decide whether your name is used. You decide what stays private. And the desks. I do not know yet. The loan? I do not know. The customers? I do not know. Silas placed the tool on the bench. You are offering uncertainty. Yes. At least the settlement was honest about what it bought. Mac accepted the criticism. He had no clean alternative to offer. Only the refusal to let money make the question disappear. Silas resumed working. The conversation was over, but not resolved. In the afternoon, Mac watched him cut the same concealed relief channel he had demonstrated the previous day. Bramble slept through the sound of the hand plane. Mac remembered why he had first entered a woodworking shop after leaving the service. He had wanted a place where no one knew his history, where a good result did not depend on telling a compelling story about the man who produced it. Somewhere between the first viral video and the expansion loan, he had rebuilt the same burden in a new form. He had made himself the hero of every product. Now another man stood at his bench, shaping the detail that made the desk survive winter. And Mac understood how little heroism had to do with it. The law might allow him to keep the design. The bank might require him to keep producing it. His contracts might protect him from being called a thief. But none of those things could answer the question that followed him through the quiet workshop. What did it mean to own something, if the only way to keep it was to ensure the person who made it remained invisible? Mac did not sleep the night before the announcement. He sat at the kitchen table until the windows changed from black to gray, listening to the refrigerator cycle and the faint movement of bramble somewhere in the hall. The draft statement remained open on his laptop. He had written 6 versions. The first sounded like a legal notice. The second sounded like an apology written by a marketing department. The third blamed the licensing archive so carefully that Mac could feel himself hiding behind every sentence. By the fourth, he had begun using words such as misunderstanding, attribution concern, and disputed provenance. They were accurate words. They were also excellent places for a man to disappear. Silas entered the kitchen shortly before 6. He wore the same wool shirt he had arrived in, though Mac had washed the soot from it. His white hair was still damp from the shower, and the shadows beneath his eyes made him look more severe than usual. He glanced at the laptop. "You have been typing for hours, mostly deleting. That is often the better half of writing." Mac turned the screen toward him. Silas did not sit. The statement began by announcing an immediate pause on new sales of the Monadnock desk, while Holloway Northworks reviewed questions surrounding the design's historical authorship and commercial licensing. It acknowledged that the desk had been developed from a licensed digital pattern rather than created entirely by Mac. It stated that significant portions of production had been completed with CNC equipment and approved fabrication partners. Despite years of promotional language emphasizing solitary handcraft, Mac had included Silas's name only once, in a paragraph identifying him as the craftsman, whose earlier work appeared to contain the design's essential structure. Silas read the entire statement in silence. When he finished, he scrolled to the top and read it again. "What?" Mac asked. "You say the marketing may have created an incomplete impression." "It did. It created the exact impression you paid it to create." Mac leaned back. "You want me to say I lied? I want you to decide whether you did." The answer should have been simple. Mac had never claimed that every cut was made by hand. The website used phrases such as "finished in our New Hampshire workshop" and "built with traditional discipline." The product videos showed hand planing, fitting, oiling, and assembly. The CNC machine appeared in the background of one photograph, blurred beyond easy recognition. Nothing had been explicitly fabricated, but the cumulative story had been constructed with precision. Customers were shown what Mac knew they wanted to believe. He looked at the statement again. Then he replaced the sentence. "For years, I allowed customers to believe that I personally originated the Monadnock design and built each desk primarily by hand. That belief benefited my company." It was not fully true. Silas read the new wording. He nodded once. "That sentence has weight. It may crush the business. Weight does that sometimes." Mac closed the laptop before irritation could become argument. The public announcement was scheduled for noon. Before then, he had to speak with the people whose livelihoods were tied to Holloway Northworks. There were only 4 of them. But the number did not make the responsibility smaller. Tessa Morgan arrived first. She managed customer service, scheduling, and most of the company's online communication. At 36, Tessa had an open, freckled face and curly brown hair, usually tied high above her head with a pencil pushed through it. She had joined Mac when the company still shipped 5 pieces a month and had built the order system that now tracked 70 Monadnock desks. Luis Ortega came next from the finishing room. He was 42, compact and deliberate. with close-cropped black hair, and the habit of rubbing dried oil from his fingertips, even when they were already clean. He had worked in cabinet shops since his teens and distrusted anything described as a family business unless the payroll arrived on time. The last two were Hannah Pike, a part-time bookkeeper with 2 decades of experience, repairing other people's bad records, and Dev Barlow, a 28-year-old machine operator whose calm around the CNC controls contrasted sharply with Bramble's dislike of them. Mac gathered everyone near the assembly tables. Silas stayed in the office. Raina joined by video call from her gallery. Mac did not stand behind a lectern or prepare coffee. He wanted no gestures that suggested this was a meeting with a manageable agenda. He told them about Silas. He explained the design archive, the uncertain transfer of rights, the older furniture, the missing structural detail, and the warranty failures. Then he told them the part that required no legal review. He had allowed the company's public identity to imply that the Monadnock desk was his original design and that the work was more exclusively handmade than it was. Tessa's expression changed first. No shock. Recognition. You knew customers thought you designed it, she said. Yes. And when they said it in emails, I did not correct them. Tessa looked toward the wall where framed magazine features hung beside product photographs. Luis folded his arms. What happens to the current orders? I'm suspending new sales at noon. Existing customers will receive a full explanation and a choice to wait, switch to another product, or request a refund. Hannah spoke without looking up from the numbers on her tablet. How many refunds can we cover? Not all at once. That is not an answer. No, Max said. It isn't. Dev glanced toward the silent CNC machine. Are we shutting down? I don't know. The room held the sentence differently than Silas had. Employees could not build rent payments around a man's moral uncertainty. Luis stepped closer to the nearest unfinished desk. I never told anyone I carved these legs by hand. I know. I ran the finishing schedule you approved. Dev ran the files you bought. Tessa answered from the product information she was given. I know. Then do not write some statement that says we failed. Mac looked at him. Luis's face remained controlled, but anger sharpened his voice. You failed. Maybe Raina failed. Do not spread it across everyone because plural language sounds less lonely. Raina's image on the monitor went still. Mac felt the truth of the criticism before he felt its sting. You're right. Tessa looked at him. Are you actually going to say that publicly? Yes. She gave a quiet breath that might have been relief or fear. Mac distributed the final statement and the customer options. Hannah immediately began listing cash flow scenarios. Tessa opened a blank response document for the support inbox. Dev asked which production files should be frozen. Luis said nothing else, but he stayed. At 11:58, Mac returned to the office. Bramble lay beside the door. Silas stood near the back wall, not looking at the screen. You do not have to be here, Mac said. I know. You can still ask me not to use your name. I know that too. Mac waited. Silas moved toward the window overlooking Juniper Lane. My name was removed once because someone found it useful, he said. I will not remove it myself because I am afraid of strangers. Mac opened the broadcast page. The company had more than 200,000 followers across its platforms. At noon, the live feed began populating with names, greetings, and questions about the next furniture release. Mac had used this room for product demonstrations, Veterans Day messages, and videos about discipline in craftsmanship. The lighting had been selected to make the walnut cabinets behind him look warm. A framed flag sat just beyond the camera line. His canvas apron hung on a hook where viewers could see it. He removed the apron. Then he moved the flag out of frame, not because either object was false, because neither should stand between the statement and the man making it. He began without music. My name is Cormac Holloway. I own Holloway Northworks, and I need to correct the story I have told about our best-selling desk. The comment stream slowed. Mac read from the statement only twice. For the rest, he spoke directly. He explained that he had legally purchased a commercial design file. He had modified and manufactured it for years. He had not knowingly stolen it. Then he said that those facts were no longer enough. He described Silas Bellweather as the craftsman whose earlier work contained the design's defining structure and functional reasoning. He explained that the available licensing records remained disputed and incomplete. He did not tell the story of Margaret. He did not mention the basement cot, Nadine's letters, or the unfinished apology desk. Those belonged to Silas. Mac spoke instead about himself. I let customers credit me with creating a design I had adapted from a licensed file. I accepted interviews that described the desk as an expression of my personal recovery. I knew that description was stronger than the truth, and I allowed it because it helped sell the work. The comments began moving rapidly. Some viewers wrote that they respected the honesty. Others demanded refunds before he had finished speaking. A message appeared accusing Silas of waiting until the business became successful before inventing a claim. Mac saw Silas read it from across the room. He continued, "Our marketing also encouraged the impression that each Monadnock desk was made almost entirely by my hands using traditional methods. In reality, we use CNC equipment, outside milling, and production assistants. Skilled people complete that work, but I allowed their contribution to disappear behind an image of me working alone." The number of viewers increased. Someone had shared the broadcast beyond his followers. Mac felt his pulse in his throat. He had spoken under worse conditions, but fear behaved differently. When no one else had ordered him into the room, he announced the suspension of new Monadnock sales. Existing customers would receive individual notices within 24 hours. Each could remain in the queue pending resolution, transfer their deposit to another Holloway design, or request a full refund under a staggered repayment plan with written dates. He did not promise the business would survive. He did not ask for forgiveness. At the end, he looked directly into the camera. The people who work here did not create this situation. I made the decisions about the product story, the interviews, and what we allowed customers to believe. Responsibility for that is mine, and of mina. Proof, and of los, of lordy. Mac ended the broadcast. For several seconds, no one moved. Then every phone in the workshop began making noise. Tessa's inbox received more than 300 messages in the first 10 minutes. 2 retailers requested emergency calls. The bank's commercial lending office left a voicemail. 1 design publication asked for comment. Raina's gallery website slowed under increased traffic. The announcement did not bring relief. It brought velocity. By 2 in the afternoon, 38 customers had requested refunds. 21 chose to wait. 7 sent messages of support without stating what they wanted. 1 customer wrote that her husband had ordered the desk before his death, and that she no longer knew whether keeping it would honor him or embarrass him. Mac read that message twice. He had expected anger about money. He had not understood how deeply some customers had attached their own memories to the story he sold. Tessa found him standing in the office. "You need to stop reading every message as it arrives. They deserve answers. They deserve organized answers. Not you collapsing into each one individually." She set a printed triage plan on the desk. Refund requests would be separated from legal threats. Existing warranty claims would receive priority. Media inquiries would go through Raina and Judith. Personal messages would be acknowledged without promising immediate replies. Mac looked at the document. "You made this already? I have been cleaning up after product launches for 5 years. Disaster uses many of the same folders. End of I end of I, and for the first time that day, Mac nearly laughed. Then Tessa's expression hardened. Do not mistake my staying for approval. I won't. I have a mortgage. I know. No. You know you have a mortgage. Mine is not part of your character development. Mac lowered his eyes. You're right. She left before he could say anything else. At 3:15, Raina called from the gallery. Her face appeared on the office monitor, composed but pale. 2 collectors had canceled private appointments. A retailer in Boston had removed Holloway Northworks from its spring catalog. Another wanted written assurance that no other designs had disputed origins. We need an inventory review of every pattern, she said. I've started it. We also need to decide whether the gallery continues representing you. Mac looked at her. That sounds like you already decided. It sounds like I have a landlord, staff, and artists who did not agree to become collateral in your confession. You helped write the product story. Yes, the word came without defense. Raina looked away from the camera for a moment. I told myself we were translating craftsmanship for customers. I knew we were simplifying. I did not ask when simplification became invention. Mac had not expected the admission. It changed nothing financially. It changed the conversation. What are you going to do? He asked. Not decide today. She ended the call soon after. The bank called at 4. The loan officer did not accuse Mac of dishonesty. He spoke instead about material adverse changes, revenue forecasts, reputational risk, and the requirement to provide updated financials within 5 business days. Business language had the peculiar ability to describe panic without raising its voice. By sunset, 56 refund requests had arrived. Hannah calculated that meeting them within 30 days would leave Holloway Northworks unable to make the next equipment payment. Laurel recommended requesting formal forbearance immediately. Louise went home at 6 after locking the finishing room chemicals. Dev stayed an extra hour to help freeze the Monadnock production files. Tessa continued working through messages, despite having already exceeded her shift. Silas had remained mostly in the workshop, far from the cameras. Mac found him at the bench after everyone else left. The old man was not working on Nadine's desk. He was repairing one of the failed Monadnock drawer assemblies from the warranty shelf. You do not owe that customer anything, Mac said. Silas continued paring the damaged shoulder. No, you do. Then why are you fixing it? Because the wood did not make the promise. Mac stood beside him. The repaired joint would not erase the misleading story, restore canceled contracts, or return money already spent. It was one small correction in a room full of consequences. Silas set the chisel down. I watched the broadcast. Mac waited for judgment. Silas said, You used my name. You gave permission. I did. If you regret it, I do not. Silas turned the drawer assembly over. You told the truth, as if telling it were the difficult part. It wasn't? No. The difficult part begins when the truth has finished speaking and still expects you to get up the next morning. Mac looked across the workshop. The assembly tables remained full. The CNC machine was dark. Order tags hung from unfinished pieces that might never be completed. Bramble entered from the house and walked past both men. Instead of settling beneath Silas's bench, he lay in the center aisle, between the hand tools and the silent machine. Mac understood the placement, without assigning it more meaning than it held. There was no side of the room untouched by what had happened. Late that night, Mac opened the company website again. The Monadnock desk page no longer displayed a purchase button. In its place sat the public statement and a notice explaining the order options. The photographs remained. Mac considered removing them. Instead, he edited the caption beneath the main image. Originally marketed as an original Holloway Northworks design. Production paused pending attribution and licensing review. Historical design contribution credited to Silas Bellweather. He clicked save. The page looked less polished. It also looked more accurate. Mac closed the laptop and turned off the office light. He had imagined confession as a line a man crossed from concealment into honesty. It was not a line. It was a door. Once opened, it allowed every person affected by the truth to enter carrying a different loss. Customers entered with broken trust. Employees entered with endangered paychecks. Reina entered with her own complicity. Silas entered with a name restored publicly, but no guarantee that restoration would improve his life. And Mac remained responsible for meeting all of them, without pretending that one truthful statement had repaired what years of omission had built. Outside, the snow had stopped. Across Juniper Lane, the Victorian stood in darkness. Inside Holloway Northworks, the machines were silent, the refund total was rising, and Mac's name was more visible than it had ever been. For the first time, however, it was attached not to a legend about the man he wanted customers to see, but to a decision whose consequences he could no longer edit. The bank sent 2 people instead of 1. They arrived at Holloway Northworks on Monday morning in a gray sport utility vehicle with no snow on the wheel wells, as if the storm had been something they had passed through rather than lived inside. Mac recognized the loan officer, Peter Sloan, from the expansion signing 6 weeks earlier. Peter was a careful man in his early 50s, whose suits always looked selected to avoid being remembered. Beside him stood a younger woman carrying a tablet and a laser measuring device. "This is Mara Keene from Asset Services," Peter said. Mara wore steel-toed boots beneath charcoal trousers and kept her blonde hair pulled into a smooth knot. She acknowledged Mac with a professional smile, then looked past him toward the workshop. She had not come to discuss intentions. She had come to determine what could be taken. The employees were already inside. Tessa had muted the customer service phone. Dev stood near the CNC machine with his hands in his pockets. Luis remained in the finishing room doorway, while Hannah sat in the office with Laurel's revised cash flow report open across 2 screens. Silas worked at the far bench. He did not look up when the bank representatives entered. Bramble did. Peter removed his gloves. "We received the updated financials. You received them Friday. We completed the review this morning." Mac waited. Peter glanced toward the office where the company's framed press features had been taken down, leaving clean rectangles on the wall. "The revenue covenant will be breached at the end of this month if the refund schedule continues at the current rate." "I know. The equipment note is also exposed." "I know that too." Mara activated her tablet. "We need current condition photographs and serial verification for financed assets." Dev stepped away from the CNC machine. Mac felt the movement more sharply than he expected. The machine had been installed only months earlier. He remembered signing the delivery form while snowmelt ran from the truck tires across the floor. He had stood beside it for a photograph, one hand resting on the control cabinet, speaking about growth, capacity, and the future of American craft. Now Mara photographed the serial plate. The flash reflected from the polished metal. Mac had believed the difficult part would be losing the machine. Instead, the difficult part was watching someone converted from ambition back into an asset. Peter lowered his voice. "The bank has not declared default. Not yet. We are considering a 30-day standstill, but only if you provide an acceptable restructuring plan." "What counts as acceptable?" "Reduced operating expenses, a credible source of refund liquidity, and evidence that the business can generate revenue without the disputed product." Laurel entered from the office carrying printed projections. "We have 3 versions." Peter accepted them. The first preserved the CNC machine and reduced staff hours drastically. The second sold the machine privately, repaid its financing, and used the remaining equity for customer refunds. The third closed the workshop entirely, liquidated equipment, and attempted to preserve Mac's house through a negotiated settlement. Mara stopped taking photographs. Even she seemed to understand that the third option changed the meaning of the visit. Peter read silently. Mac watched his eyes move down the pages. "We can submit the second plan," Peter said. "But a projected private sale is not cash. I have 2 interested buyers. Letters of interest?" Dev contacted one shop. Laurel found another. Dev looked at Mac. It was the first he had heard that his conversation with a former employer had become part of the restructuring plan. Peter placed the papers on the nearest table. If the sale closes within 10 business days, and if the proceeds meet the minimum threshold, I can recommend the standstill. Recommend. I do not approve it alone. Mac had heard the distinction before. Every institution contained a person whose authority ended just before the decision became merciful. Peter looked toward Silas. The disputed design remains suspended? Yes. Permanently? I don't know. The answer no longer embarrassed Mac. Peter did not seem impressed by it. The committee will want certainty. So will I. Mara completed the inventory and left first. Peter stayed near the loading door. I watched your statement, he said quietly. Mac studied him. That was not part of the credit review. No. Then why mention it? Peter put on his gloves. My father ran a machine shop. He lost it during the recession because he waited too long to tell the bank the orders had stopped. Mac expected a lesson. Peter gave none. He thought asking early would make him look weak, Peter said. By the time he asked, the only honest answer was no. He opened the door. I cannot promise you a favorable decision, but asking before the account failed matters. Then he left. The workshop remained quiet after the vehicle pulled away. Tessa restarted the phone system. Luis returned to the finishing room. Hannah closed one projection and opened another. Everyone behaved as if work still existed, because stopping would make the alternative too visible. Mac walked to the CNC machine. Dev stood beside him. You already found a buyer? Dev asked. Possibly. You were going to tell me? Yes. When? Mac had no defensible answer. Dev looked at the machine's dark control screen. I left a cabinet shop for this job. I know. They said automation was the future. You said there would be room here to learn programming, design, maintenance. I meant it. That does not help much now. No. Dev rubbed one palm across the back of his neck. If you sell it, you won't need me. Not in the same role. That is another way to say it. Mac could have offered reassurance. He could have described a future workshop with hand tools, small runs, and collaborative commissions. He had begun to distrust promises made before costs were known. I can pay you through the end of the month, he said. After that, I can offer fewer hours doing layout, jigs, and production planning. I'll also give you paid time to interview elsewhere. Dev looked at him. That's the plan? It's what I can promise today. The younger man nodded slowly. It's not much. No, but it's real. Mac watched him walk away. Honesty did not make losses smaller. It only prevented false hope from becoming an additional debt. By noon, one of the buyers requested a demonstration. Mac refused to run the Monadnock file. Dev loaded a generic cabinet door program instead. The CNC spindle moved through its paths with the same clean indifference it had shown before the crisis. Bramble waited outside. The buyer, a production manager from a millwork company in Vermont, inspected the rails, vacuum pump, hours of operation, and maintenance history. He never asked what the machine had meant to Mac. That helped. The offer arrived by email 40 minutes later. It was lower than Laurel's target. High enough to repay the equipment note, not high enough to cover all customer refunds. Mac forwarded it to Peter and Laurel. Then he walked into the office and accepted it. No ceremony accompanied the decision. There was no final sweep of music. No sudden sense of liberation. The confirmation screen displayed a transaction number. That was all. When Mac returned to the workshop, Silas had stopped working. You sold it, he said. Mac looked toward the CNC machine. Yes. To save the house? To keep the bank from Rongi taking everything while I decide what the business becomes. Silas set down his plane. You blame me. The question came without accusation. That made it more difficult. Mac considered lying. Some moments, yes. Silas accepted the answer with a small movement of his head. Mac continued. I also blame the archive. Everett. Raina. The market. Myself. Depending on the hour, I can arrange the list in any order I want. And now? Now I have to stop treating blame as a business plan. Silas looked toward the machine. I wanted you to understand what was taken from me. You succeeded. I did not want this. Mac almost laughed. You offered to let me keep selling. I thought money would make losing the name bearable. Would it have? No. The word rested between them. Partial truths had brought them into conflict. Complete honesty had not yet made them friends. But for the first time, neither man was trying to force the other into a cleaner role. Mac was not merely the thief. Silas was not merely the victim. They were two men standing in the consequences of choices made under pressure, each hoping the other would carry more of the guilt. Silas moved to the unfinished desk for Nadine. The top had been fitted. The hidden drawer now traveled smoothly. Only the writing surface and final edge work remained. My hands will not finish the bench, he said. Mac looked at him. What bench? Silas pointed toward several lengths of black cherry stacked beneath the window. I was going to build one after the desk. For Nadine? For the workshop. There may not be a workshop. Then it will be for wherever the tools go. Mac examined the lumber. The boards were narrow, irregular, and heavily figured. They would not suit production furniture. Every piece carried evidence of the tree's stressed dark mineral lines, a knot near one edge, a section where the grain turned abruptly around an old wound. What kind of bench? Mac asked. One long enough for two people who do not agree. It was the closest Silas had come to an invitation. Mac did not answer immediately. Silas handed him a marking gauge. They began that afternoon. The bench was not part of any order. It would not be photographed for the website or offered as a limited edition. There were no deadlines beyond the sale crew arriving in 4 days to dismantle the CNC machine. Silas established the proportions. Mac corrected the lumber for twist. They argued about the leg angle. Then built a full-size mock-up from scrap, instead of proving either man right through stubbornness. The work changed the rhythm of the shop. There was no separation between designer and fabricator. Silas marked joints, but Mac altered one stretcher to accommodate the weakness in the knot. Mac proposed hidden steel reinforcement, and Silas rejected it until a test piece split under load. Then Silas approved the steel without pretending it had been his idea. Bramble slept beneath the window. Dev watched for several minutes before returning to his workstation. Luis brought over a jar of finish and said the cherry would darken too heavily if they used Mac's standard oil. Tessa asked whether the bench had an order number. No, Mac said. Then how do I track it? You don't. She looked suspicious of any object existing outside a spreadsheet, but she smiled before walking away. The customer messages continued. The bank had not approved the standstill. Raina still had not confirmed whether the gallery would keep representing Holloway Northworks. None of those uncertainties disappeared while the bench took shape, yet the work was different because it did not pretend to solve them. Near the end of the second day, Silas cut one mortise too wide. He stared at it. Mac waited for anger. Silas reached for another board. We can patch it, Mac said. It will show. Yes. Silas looked at him. You would leave it visible? If we make the patch honest. The old man's mouth tightened. Once, Silas might have discarded the entire leg rather than permit evidence of error. Mac knew because he recognized the impulse. Silas handed him the chisel. Show me. Mac selected a contrasting piece of maple and cut a narrow insert. He did not try to hide the repair beneath stain. He shaped it carefully and left the pale wood visible against the dark cherry. When the glue dried, the patch resembled a small vertical line. Not decorative, not invisible, necessary. Silas ran his thumb over it. Nadine would hate that. Then she would notice it. Silas gave a brief laugh. It was the first sound of uncomplicated amusement Mac had heard from him. On the morning the machine was removed, the sale crew arrived with dollies, straps, and a forklift. Dev shut down the control system for the last time. He backed up the generic production files, erased customer data, and handed Mac the storage drive containing the suspended Monadnock program. Mac placed it in the office safe with the contracts and historical records. Not destroyed, not used. held until ownership and future terms could be decided. The crew disconnected the extraction ducts. Bolts came out of the concrete. Power cables were capped. The CNC machine moved toward the loading door, one measured foot at a time. Bramble stood inside the workshop. He did not retreat to the porch. Dev noticed first. So it really was the machine. Mac looked at the dog. Maybe it was what the machine changed in the room. Dev considered that. Dogs don't usually analyze production culture. No. Bramble yawned and lay down beside a stack of hand-cut rails. The machine passed through the loading door. Cold air poured into the workshop through the opening it left behind. For months, the CNC had occupied the largest section of the floor. When it was gone, the empty concrete seemed almost architectural, a new room created by subtraction. Mac expected to feel grief. He felt it. He also felt embarrassment at the relief beneath it. The sale proceeds went directly to the lender. Peter called that afternoon. The committee approved a 60-day standstill, conditional on monthly reporting and the customer repayment plan. The house would remain secure as long as Mac met the revised terms. Not saved, not safe forever. Secure for 60 days. It was enough to work with. Laurel helped rebuild the operating model. Holloway Northworks would stop high-volume furniture production. Existing non-disputed orders would be completed in small batches. Luis would oversee finishing and repair services. Tessa would manage customer repayment schedules and a new commission process with full production disclosures. Hannah would remain part-time. Dev accepted reduced hours temporarily while applying to larger shops with Mac's recommendation. Silas would not transfer his designs. He agreed instead to advise on repairs to existing monadnock desks and to negotiate attribution and compensation separately with Judith present. No one called it a partnership. Not yet. By Friday evening, the final bench stood where the CNC machine had been. It was long, heavy, and imperfectly symmetrical. The cherry grain changed direction across the top. The pale maple repair remained visible in one leg. Beneath the seat, Silas carved his 3 diagonal marks. Then he handed the chisel to Mac. Mac hesitated. "I don't have a mark. You have a name. I have used that too freely." "Then make something smaller." Mac cut a single horizontal line beside the 3 marks. Not touching them, not beneath them, beside them. Silas examined the result. "That will do." They sat on opposite ends of the bench. For several minutes, neither spoke. The workshop looked stripped without the machine. The empty wall showed bolt holes and a pale rectangle where the control cabinet had blocked years of dust. Unfinished furniture still waited on racks. Refund schedules remained taped inside the office. Nothing resembled victory. Silas rested both hands on the bench. "Nadine called," he said. Mac turned toward him. Silas looked straight ahead. "I left a message yesterday. She returned it this morning." "What did she say?" "That I have always taken too long to finish things." Mac waited. "She agreed to see me." The relief in Silas's face was almost impossible to distinguish from fear. "When?" "Next week." Mac nodded toward the unfinished desk. "You'll be ready." "No," Silas said. "But the desk will be." The answer was progress enough. Bramble walked over and settled between their boots. This time neither man tried to interpret the choice. Outside, evening snow began lightly over Juniper Lane. Across the road, the Victorian remained under bank ownership. The porch still sagged. The basement workshop remained locked. Mac did not know whether Holloway Northworks would survive beyond the 60-day standstill. He did know what it would no longer be. It would not sell the illusion of a solitary hero. It would not hide machines, employees, licensed patterns, repairs, or borrowed ideas behind a better story. The new business would be smaller, slower, more expensive to operate, and harder to market. It would depend on commissions, restoration, repair, and work whose makers were named before the first deposit was taken. Mac looked along the length of the bench. 2 men had built it. One joint had failed and been repaired. The marks beneath it did not merge into a single signature. They remained separate, close enough to share the weight. 1 year later, the workshop opened its doors before the sun had cleared the ridge. No launch announcement preceded it. There was no countdown, no promotional film, and no photograph of Max standing alone beneath the Holloway Northworks sign. Tessa had posted the hours on the website 3 days earlier. Open workshop Saturday. Repairs, demonstrations, and questions welcome. No sales presentation. By 8, 6 cars had parked along Juniper Lane. By 9, there were 14. Max stood near the entrance, with a broom in his hands, watching visitors stamp snow from their boots onto the rubber mat. He recognized 2 former Monadnock customers. A retired school teacher, who had commissioned a dining table, and a young cabinet maker from Maine, who had driven 3 hours after reading about the new apprenticeship program. Most of the faces were unfamiliar. That was a relief. Bramble greeted each visitor according to a system known only to him. Some received a brief inspection. Others earned a slow wag. He ignored a local reporter entirely and settled beneath the long cherry bench where the CNC machine had once stood. The bench had acquired scratches. One pale maple repair remained visible in its leg. No one had tried to polish either away. The workshop itself looked smaller than it had during the years of high production. The assembly tables had been rearranged into 3 shared stations. Open shelving replaced the old rows of numbered product components. Each active project had a card attached to it, listing the client, designer, principal maker, contributing craftspeople, materials, machine processes, hand processes, and any licensed references. The cards were not elegant. They were specific. Mac had learned that specificity rarely photographed, as well as myth. It survived questions better. Near the office, Tessa demonstrated the commission system to a couple considering a writing desk. Her curls were shorter now, though she still kept a pencil behind one ear. She showed them the estimate line by line, including labor hours, outside milling, design fees, and the names of everyone expected to touch the piece. "There may be changes," she said, "but there won't be invisible people." The couple exchanged a glance. The husband asked whether that made the furniture more expensive. "Yes," Tessa said. The answer did not seem to alarm her. Luis worked in the finishing room with the door propped open. He had installed a ventilation monitor above the frame and written the current air quality reading on a small board beside it. 2 visitors watched as he tested oil on 3 samples from the same walnut board. "Wood does not have one color," he told them. "It has several arguments about color. Finish decides which argument becomes loudest." Mac heard a woman laugh. Luis did not. He was too focused on the samples. Hannah had reduced her hours again after the company completed the last scheduled customer refund 4 months earlier. She now came in twice a week, reviewed the accounts remotely, and sent Mac messages whenever his optimism exceeded the cash balance. The 60-day bank standstill had become 6 months of supervised restructuring, then a conventional repayment schedule secured by a smaller balance and the workshop property alone. Mac's house was no longer collateral. The letter releasing it had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. He had placed the document in the safe without celebration, then taken Bramble for a walk through the thawing woods. Relief had felt quieter than fear. Dev no longer worked for Holloway Northworks. He had accepted a position at the Vermont Millwork Company that purchased the CNC machine. Within 6 months, he was supervising 2 production cells and developing training procedures for new operators. He visited occasionally. The first time he returned, Bramble smelled machine oil on his coat and refused to sit beside him for 10 minutes. Dev claimed not to be offended. No one believed him. At the far end of the workshop, Silas stood before 4 apprentices. He no longer lived in Mac's guest room. Nadine had helped him secure a modest apartment above a pharmacy in North Conway, close enough to walk to the grocery store and far enough from the workshop that he could leave before exhaustion became stubbornness. He still ignored most advice about rest. At 67, his frame remained spare, but he no longer looked temporary inside his clothes. Nadine had replaced the frayed wool shirt with 3 nearly identical ones, which Silas described as unnecessary interference and wore every day. The apprentices gathered around a walnut frame joint. 2 were professional craftspeople adding restoration skills. 1 was a community college student. The 4th, a retired dentist named Arthur Pell, had spent 40 years working at a scale measured in millimeters and still approached every chisel as if it might sue him for malpractice. Silas held up the joint. "This is not loose because the maker lacked skill," he said. "It is loose because the maker expected the wood to stop behaving like wood." Arthur raised a hand. Silas looked displeased by the classroom gesture but allowed it. "How do we know when movement is acceptable?" "We don't." Arthur waited. Silas continued. "We calculate. We choose. We leave tolerance. Then we remain humble enough to repair what calculation did not predict." Mac paused near the lumber rack. A year earlier, Silas would have said the joint had failed because someone misunderstood the material. He would have located the error, named the guilty hand, and defended his own reasoning as though certainty were evidence of character. Now he included himself in the possibility of miscalculation. The change was small enough that most people would miss it. Mac did not. On the wall behind Silas hung the first completed record from the Bellweather Holloway Repair Archive. They had chosen the name after 3 weeks of disagreement. Silas had rejected Holloway Bellweather because alphabetical order was not a moral principle. Mac had proposed no names at all. Judith Vale had informed both men that anonymity was an especially poor solution to a dispute about attribution. The archive now contained measurements, photographs, repair notes, original sources, licensing histories, and corrected structural drawings for every Monadnock desk submitted by an owner. Silas received compensation for consultation and historical documentation. Mac's company performed the repairs. Neither man owned the archive alone. Copies were held by the Alder-Wake Historical Society and the State Craft Museum, ensuring that no private dispute could remove the record again. The legal settlement had taken 9 months. Everett Voss never appeared in person. Through his attorney, he produced additional partnership records, including an agreement that granted him authority to sell digital reproductions during the final years of Bellweather and Voss. The document was valid but narrower than the later transfers suggested. Northridge Pattern Cooperative had purchased rights Everett could partly convey and had marketed them as broader than they were. No single villain emerged cleanly from the paperwork. Everett had exceeded his authority. Northridge had failed to verify the scope. Mac had bought in good faith, then built a misleading origin story around what he purchased. Silas had neglected agreements, records, and relationships until other people could define his work without him. The final arrangement reflected that untidy truth. The original Monadnock desk was no longer produced commercially. Existing owners could keep, return, repair, or resell their desks. Each received documentation explaining the design history and the contributions of Bellweather and Voss, Holloway Northworks, and the employees who built the individual piece. A revised writing desk had been developed jointly, but Silas refused to let it become the Monadnock II. "Furniture is not a failed military campaign," he said when Raina suggested the name. They called it the Juniper desk. The first one stood near the center of the workshop. It did not resemble the Monadnock closely enough to be mistaken for a correction. The legs were straighter. The hidden drawer had been removed. The writing surface floated above 2 visible cross supports that allowed seasonal movement without concealment. Nothing in the structure pretended not to be doing work. A small brass plate beneath the rear rail read, "Designed by Silas Bellweather and Cormac Holloway." Below that were the names: Joinery, Cormac Holloway, and Arthur Pell. Surface preparation, Luis Ortega. Finish development, Luis Ortega and Mei Chen. Commission Coordination, Tessa Morgan. Historical review, Owen Kittredge. The list was longer than the brand name. Mac considered that an improvement. A woman stood reading the plate. She was in her early 60s, with dark red hair streaked heavily with silver and a long green coat folded over one arm. Her posture was less rigid than Silas's, but the resemblance between them was visible around the eyes. Nadine Bellweather had arrived without telling him. She had visited the workshop several times during the year, though never on a public day. She disliked crowds, sentiment used as decoration, and any suggestion that forgiving Silas had been immediate. The desk he built for her now stood in her apartment. She used it to pay bills, write letters, and keep a ceramic bowl full of screws she had removed from furniture without remembering where they belonged. Silas claimed this proved she should not own tools. Nadine claimed it proved she did not worship them. Their reconciliation had not restored the years between them. It had given them somewhere to place the next conversation. Nadine ran one finger beneath the juniper desk's brass plate. "You put your own name first," she said when Silas approached. "It is alphabetical. Last year, you said alphabetical order was not a moral principle." Silas glanced at Mac. He remembers too much. Someone has to. Silas noticed the unfinished repair form in Nadine's hand. "What did you break?" "Nothing." "Then why are you holding that?" "I'm considering donating Margaret's sewing cabinet to the archive." The public noise around them seemed to recede. Silas looked at her carefully. The cabinet had been one of his earliest pieces for Margaret. Its drawers were narrow, its legs too delicate, and one hinge had been replaced with hardware from a kitchen cupboard during a year when they could not afford the correct part. Silas had once called that repair humiliating. Nadine had called it part of the cabinet's life. "You kept it?" he asked. "Of course I kept it. I thought it was sold with the house contents. I bought it before the auction." Silas looked down at the repair form. Nadine held it toward him. "I want the record to include the wrong hinge." Silas did not take the paper immediately. Mac watched the decision pass across his face. A year earlier, Silas might have insisted on restoring the cabinet before anyone saw it. He might have replaced the hinge, refinished the wood, and removed every sign that necessity had once interrupted craftsmanship. Now he accepted the form. "The hinge is not wrong," he said. "It is incorrect for the period." Nadine smiled. "That is the closest you have come to agreeing with me." Silas looked toward the apprentices. "We will document it next Thursday." "You are asking me?" "I am informing you politely. Still progress." She touched his sleeve before walking toward Tessa. Silas remained beside the juniper desk, holding the form with both hands. Mac returned to the entrance. A man he did not recognize waited near the display of repaired monadnock joints. He wore a red flannel shirt beneath a work vest and held a folded copy of Mac's original public statement. "My wife bought one of those desks," he said. Mac prepared himself. "Which year?" 3 years ago. "Has it developed a problem?" "No." The man looked toward Silas. "She kept it." Mac waited for the rest. "She said the desk did not become worthless because the story changed. That was her decision. She also said the new story should stay attached to it." Mac nodded. "We provide a permanent history plate and documentation if she wants them." "She does." The man handed Mac the folded statement. "My wife printed this the day you posted it. She said she wanted to remember the first time a company told her something before a court forced it to." Mac looked at the paper. He had received praise before. This did not feel like praise. It felt like a standard he might still fail to meet. "We were late," he said. The man nodded. "But not last." He wrote down his wife's order number and left. By noon, the workshop was crowded enough that Tessa began limiting entry. Raina arrived carrying coffee and no camera crew. She still represented Holloway Northworks, though the agreement had changed. Her gallery commissions listed designers, makers, production methods, and licensing histories on the sales cards. 2 artists had objected and left. 3 others joined because of it. Raina had stopped calling transparency a marketing advantage in Mac's presence. She had also become very good at marketing it. Mac did not challenge the contradiction. Purity had caused enough damage in the building. Near closing time, the visitors gathered around the juniper desk for a scheduled demonstration. Mac and Silas were supposed to explain the floating top. Instead, Silas handed the demonstration to Arthur. The retired dentist looked alarmed. "You designed it," Arthur said. "I know. You should explain it." "I know that too." Arthur looked at Mac for rescue. Mac stepped back. Arthur began awkwardly. He misnamed one support member, corrected himself, and nearly dropped the sample joint. Silas did not interrupt. By the end, Arthur had explained the movement system clearly enough that two professional woodworkers began asking technical questions. Silas answered only when Arthur could not. The choice cost Silas nothing. That was what made it significant. He was no longer protecting knowledge by making himself indispensable. After the last visitor left, Tessa locked the front door. Luis covered the finished samples. Reyna gathered abandoned coffee cups. Nadine left with a promise to return Thursday, and a warning that Silas should not touch Margaret's cabinet before she arrived. The apprentices swept the floor. Mac turned the sign to closed. The workshop settled. Silas sat on the long cherry bench. The visible maple patch had darkened slightly with age, but remained distinct. Mac joined him. Bramble walked over more slowly than he had a year earlier. At 8, his hips had begun to stiffen in cold weather. Mac had placed woven mats across the concrete to help him move without slipping. The dog lowered himself between their feet. Silas rested one hand near Bramble's shoulders without touching him. "Too many people," he said. "You invited 4 apprentices. I invited 4. The internet invited the rest." Mac looked around the room. The open project cards remained attached to the workbenches. The juniper desk stood beneath the lights. On the archive wall hung photographs of damaged joints, corrected drawings, old invoices, workshop marks, and names that had once existed separately in competing stories. The company had survived. Barely, at first. Then differently. Revenue was less than half of what it had been during the Monadnock years. Profit was smaller, though steadier. The order backlog measured 10 weeks instead of 11 months. Mac no longer appeared in every product photograph. Some customers had stopped caring. The ones who remained asked better questions. Silas reached beneath the bench and touched the marks carved there. 3 diagonal chisel cuts and 1 horizontal line. Time and use had softened their edges. "I thought names were how work survived," he said. Mac waited. "They help," Silas continued. "But a name can be preserved and still become a lie. You want yours removed?" "No." Silas looked toward the archive wall. "I want the work around it to remain accurate." Mac nodded. That was the agreement they had spent a year learning to make. Not ownership without limits. Not forgiveness without memory. Accuracy maintained by more than one person. Silas stood and went to the juniper desk. He turned it slightly so Mac could see the underside of the rear rail. There, beside the brass attribution plate, were 2 sets of marks. Silas's 3 diagonal cuts. Mac's single horizontal line. Mac had assumed the plate was the final signature. "You added these?" "This morning." "You didn't ask." "I am still learning." Mac ran his thumb beneath the marks. They were not merged. They did not imply equal history, equal loss, or equal blame. They showed only that both men had participated in this particular piece and agreed to remain answerable for it. Silas handed him the chisel. "The plate can be unscrewed," he said. "Records can be misplaced. Put the names in the wood. Aldred S. All S. Put the names in the wood. All S. All S. All duos. All S. Call S. Dot all. Call us. Call us. Call us." Mac looked at the clean space below the marks. For years, he had stamped Holloway Northworks onto shipping crates, invoices, websites, and stories about himself. This felt different. He carved slowly. Silas Bellweather. Then beneath it, leaving a deliberate space, Cormac Holloway. Silas watched the letters take shape. "You made mine straighter. You complain when letters lean. I complain when craftsmen blame tools for poor control." Mac handed him the chisel. Silas added a smaller line beneath both names. With Luis Ortega, Arthur Pell, and Tessa Morgan. Mac looked at him. Tessa didn't build the desk. She kept us from promising it before we knew the price. That counts? Silas examined the line. It held weight. They returned the desk upright. The names disappeared beneath it. A customer would have to kneel to see them. Mac preferred it that way. Not hidden, not displayed as spectacle. Placed where anyone who cared enough to look could find the truth of who had done the work. Outside, snow began falling across Juniper Lane. The Victorian no longer belonged to the bank. Owen's Historical Society had purchased it through a preservation grant, and restoration crews were stabilizing the porch and roof. The basement would eventually become a public craft archive and teaching room. Silas had refused to move back. A recovered house is not the same as a recovered life, he said. He was right. The workshop lights reflected across the road in the Victorian's newly uncovered windows. For the first time, the two buildings appeared to be looking at each other without suspicion. Mac turned off the front row of lights. Bramble waited at the door. Silas took his coat from the hook. Nadine would collect him for dinner, though he had complained twice about the restaurant she chose. They stepped outside together. The cold air smelled of snow, chimney smoke, and cut wood escaping through the workshop vents. Mac locked the door. Above it, the old sign still read, Holloway Northworks. A smaller panel had been installed beneath it. Commission, restoration, shared craft. Mac had resisted the wording. Tessa said it explained what they did. Silas said signs rarely improved a building. Bramble had offered no opinion. They crossed toward the road where Nadine's headlights had appeared beyond the trees. Mac looked back once, through the workshop window. The juniper desk stood in the center of the room. Its structure was visible. Its makers were documented. Its names were carved beneath the work, rather than placed above it. The business had not returned to what it was. Neither had the men. That was the reason both might endure. The snow continued to fall over Alder Wake, covering the road in a clean layer that would hold new tracks by morning. This time, no one needed Bramble to lead them across. Sometimes, the hardest thing to repair is not a piece of wood, but the story we have told about ourselves. Mac could have protected his name, his business, and his comfort by keeping another man invisible. Instead, he chose a truth that cost him something, and in that loss, he found work that was smaller, slower, and far more honest. In our own lives, we may not face a public confession, but we all face quiet moments when no one would know if we chose convenience over integrity. May we have the courage to leave the truth where it can be found, even when it is not flattering. Share in the comments what this story meant to you, and subscribe for more stories about loyalty, redemption, and the choices that shape a life. May God give you wisdom for the decisions no one else can make for you, and peace after you have chosen what is right.